He's Norwegian, but he's moved to Vancouver, British Columbia, and he enjoys making his wife walk across frozen lakes to get to parties. So let's hear it for Morten.
Do you remember 2012? It was when the world ended. Actually, 2012 was when something else happened. Windows 8. And Windows 8 is highly relevant to what I'm going to talk about today. You see, when they released Windows 8, they were thinking about the way that a screen works and the way we place content on the screen in a very new way for screens, but a very old way for pretty much any other kind of design. The Windows team decided that this rectangle that we have in front of us is a proper design surface. And for it to be a proper design surface, we have to impose a grid on that surface so we can create columns and rows and position content exactly where it should be on the surface. This was completely new. And to make this work, they also introduced a new tool called Blend for Visual Studio. And in 2012, I was invited down to Redmond in Washington to try this tool. And it was kind of crazy because at the time, Windows 8 had not come out yet, so this was still in beta. And they sat me in front of a computer and they said, "You're a web developer, so I want you to build a Windows 8 app." And I was like, no, I don't know how to do that. And then they gave me this tool, and I looked at it, and I was like, well, this looks oddly familiar. It has HTML and CSS. And I started writing some stuff, and then they go, no, stop. I don't want you to lay this out using your regular layout tools. I want you to use a grid to do it. And I'm like, there's no grid in CSS. And then they typed in on the bottom of the screen, -ms-grid. And I was like, what is this? And I started drawing lines on the page. And I'm like, what? I can make a grid on the page? And I said to them, why does this only exist inside Windows 8? And why is it only for the user interface, right? And they were like, don't worry about that. Just, you know. So what I didn't know at the time, that they knew, was I was seeing the very beginning of a paradigm shift. Now, you've been here at this conference for 2 days, and on day number 1, you got an introduction to what paradigms are, so I don't need to go through that again. Instead, what I want to do is tell you about the paradigm shift, because it's happening right now. And for you, it's happening today, hopefully. Who am I? I am Morten, husband of Angela, father of Leo. This is a far more accurate representation of our day-to-day life. I eat his food. He's very angry. I grew up in Norway. I like to eat blueberries. And my favorite book is actually Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. So the talk yesterday was quite amusing to me. When I'm not developing websites, I like to dance, even when it's really hot. So I wear my shorts and dance shoes. And I work for LinkedIn Learning, which used to be lynda.com. If you're interested in what that is, you can come talk to me later. I have gift cards to give away. So something really interesting happens when humans interact with an environment. Humans have a tendency of seeing something and wanting to go to it. And if there is no path, they'll just make one. If they see a shorter path, they'll just make a new path. If they see a simpler path, they'll just make a new path. If they don't like stairs, they'll make a new path. This is so common, it has a name. It's called desire paths. And this is my desire path. It's outside the LinkedIn Learning offices in Carpinteria, California. They built a new building, and then they made literally a path that went like this around a patch of grass. So when you're coming from here to here, you have to go. So on the first day, I was like, this is crazy, so I'm just going to walk straight across. And then I walked back and forth a lot. And then I took a picture of it. And then a couple of months later, other people walked up back and forth across it. And then eventually, the only rational thing happened. They put this nice paved path across. Now, this also has a name. It's called paving the cow paths. The idea is you see where people go, and then you put a road there. And surprisingly, this is actually how everything we see on the web is developed. People start doing something, they do it consistently and often enough, and then eventually the browsers or technology or whatever will just put a road there. Let me show you what I mean. So as you learned in the quiz, the very first web page was created in 1990 by Sir Tim Berners-Lee. What he wanted to do was make a simple way to share documents over a phone line. So he made a document format called HTML, where you could take a document and put it onto a web page, and then other people could access it and link inside it and everything. And this started the period of web as text. And people looked at it and said, oh, this looks like crap. I want to make it look nice. So they started doing weird things to make it look nice. It said, like, they put in a font element, and they put in like spacer elements and all sorts of weird stuff. And then this other guy who also worked at CERN, Håkon Vyum-Lie, said, you know what, we need to formalize this whole designing thing because people are doing it and it looks kind of whack. So he made cascading style sheets, and then everyone went, oh, cool, I don't understand this. And it's funny because I have a book from back then, and it literally is like, you read the book, and it's clear that the author doesn't understand it either. So it's very confusing. Then Linda Weinman published a book called, what is it? Designing Web Graphics. And she said, you know what? The web is a design surface. So we should design graphics for it and use graphics. And that started this enormous trend of actually designing stuff for the web. So we got frames and layers and Flash and all sorts of crazy nonsense. And the markup that was on the web just became total insanity. Anyone who's worked on the web at that time, like with front page or anything else, would know that the HTML on the back end was nuts. And then there was JavaScript on top of that. And then there was some crazy CSS inline, which just did not work. So Jeffrey Zeldman was like, oh, no. This is not OK. We need to formalize and standardize this. So he published a book called Designing for Web Standards. This was back in 2003. And that heralded in the period we kind of live in today, which is the web standards period, where we all write the same code, and we all try to make everything consistent, and the browsers should treat things consistently. There's only one problem. The entire premise of the web is that we take a document and put it onto a screen. But it's a document, so all the tools that we have always been centered around this idea that it's a document. So you can put block-level elements under one another, you can put inline elements next to one another, and you can float content inside any kind of box so that you get text wrapping. But when you're on the web, you want to do crazy things, like put one thing next to another thing. And that was never meant to be done. So we had to come up with weird solutions, like making two columns that have the same height required an enormous amount of JavaScript. Or if you wanted to clear a box that had two floated elements inside it, you have to like fill in a ton of CSS just to introduce an empty element in the bottom left-hand corner of the box so that the box would span around itself and the background color would come down and you wouldn't have text floating up behind it. It was just not working the way we wanted it to. And then in the middle of this, Microsoft goes, Windows 8. And everyone goes, because no one liked the new look of Windows 8. But what no one knew was that at the same time that they released Windows 8, they also put in a proposal for the CSS grid layout module. Now, I say no one knows about it because only a couple of years later, this other thing entered all the browsers, Flexbox. And everyone's like, Flexbox is awesome. We can do all the things we wanted. Flexbox, all the things. And then they went, why is CSS so... Because Flexbox looked like it was the solution to all our problems, right? You can now make equal height columns. You can flex content. You can even center vertically. It's amazing. Except Flexbox works in one direction, either horizontally or vertically. But we want to position things in 2 dimensions. It still wasn't working the way we wanted it to. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, a bunch of people, including Rachel Andrew and Jen Simmons, were silently pushing for CSS Grid, that weird thing they made for Windows 8, to get into our browsers. And this year, 2017, so 27 years after the first web page was created, for the first time, the web is actually a proper design surface. So, to summarize, people saw the web, they saw where they wanted to go, and they went, I can't go there, so I'll just start doing weird things. Then other people followed along, and eventually the browser manufacturer said, we'll just build a road, and then you can get there easily. On the web page for this conference, and right there, there's this logo. And this is a perfect representation of one of the challenges that we have on the web. If you want to do something seemingly simple, like take 3 boxes and kind of stack them on top of one another, it's not easy to do because the technology we have doesn't really allow for it. Well, what if I told you you can do that now, and you can actually do it pretty well, and you can make it responsive? And you can make it semantic and accessible, and use perfectly clean HTML, and no absolute positioning or any other crazy stuff like that. See, what you do now is you create a grid. And then you can just change the grid because it sits in CSS. This is very new and totally outside of how things currently work. If you want to play around with it, there's a code pen. You can just go in there and do that. And then you can go in and mess with the code and make your own grid and make your own fancy responsive stuff. This is that paradigm shift. And the thing with paradigm shifts is, as Thomas Kuhn defined it, it's very hard to go from one paradigm to the next because everything changes. Everything about how you do things changes right now. Pretty much everything you know about how to do web layouts is no longer accurate because we have this new way of doing it. You see, CSS Grid makes impossible things possible. And it also makes difficult things bizarrely, absurdly easy. So let me give you an example. You know this Twitter thing? People will go like, I'm sitting on the porch, stuff like that. Some places, Twitter has this feature called Twitter Moments. I discovered that it's not available here. I think it might be just like a North American thing. Don't worry, you're not missing out on anything. It's basically just a page of what is happening right now, and you open it and you go, oh, God, no, and then you go away from it. But from a design standpoint, it's interesting because it's this layout that if you make it in Photoshop or Illustrator, looks really straightforward, but if you try to make it on the web, it's super complicated. So this is the layout. You have some images and some text underneath. So you basically have a bunch of cards. You have 1 card, and then 3 cards, and then 3 cards, and then 3 cards. And you look at this, and you go, how do I make this work on the web? Well, first, you have to identify each card, right? So you get an element around each card. And then you have to put boxes around these groupings of 3 cards, so you can use flexbox to make them equal height. So now you have 1, 2, 3, 4 main boxes. Then you have to put boxes around the horizontal stacks so that you can use flexbox to make them equal width. And then you put a box around the whole damn thing so that you can make them all stack properly, right? And you end up with this markup. So what you see with just 13 cards ends up with all this nesting. Lots of nesting and it's kind of messy. And when you look at it and you look at the order of things, you see it's weird because it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And you can imagine if you keep going, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So the structure here is confusing. It's not rational the way that a human wants it. But if you ignore that and just say, this works on like a tablet device, it definitely works on a mobile device because then you just get a vertical stack. But if you have a wider screen, you really want to do something like this, right? You take up extra space. But now the order gets really confusing because now you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. But what you really want is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, right? This is how human beings think. So we have this conflict between the computer and the human. The problem is, since the beginning, so 1990, web layouts have always been broken. We just figured out ways of breaking it in new ways so that it would kind of look like it was supposed to work. Case in point, your 2-column layout. We've all done this. Whether or not you've actually done any web coding, you have encountered this. So you start with a box, and then 2 boxes inside. And then you say, I want them to be next to one another. So you use floats, and you say, hey, box number 1, can you float to the left? And box number 2, float to the right. And then the browser says, oh, so you want to text wrap around? I don't have any text, so I'm just going to collapse the containing box. And then you go, why is this happening? And then you say, OK, I know how to fix this. I'll just introduce this little empty, invisible thing in the bottom right-hand corner, and the box will span its way all the way down. But it's still not equal height. So JavaScript. But then Flexbox came, and you're like, no problem. No clear fix, nothing, just Flexbox. Dun, dun, dun. Except the designer actually wants 3 boxes, which does not work because you can't get the Flexbox to do this. So then you have to put a box around the 2 things so you can flex the box and the other thing, and then you do all this crazy stuff. This is a hack. This is not how things should work. This is like a crazy way of doing things. And it results in crazy code. It results in lots of frustration. And this has been web layouts all the way up until today. The result of it is really extreme. So any one of you use Bootstrap? People are like reluctantly going, yes, yes. Anyone use Foundation or other frameworks? So all these frameworks are actually designed to introduce grids into the web when there are no grids. And the way they do that is by creating these enormous stacks of divs inside one another that say class call, XS8, all this kind of weird stuff, right? And that's also what Twitter did with that Moments page. They have all this nesting going on, and sometimes the nesting gets a little bit out of control. But what if we didn't have to do this anymore? See, the problem is the current tools, so up until this point, have been content out and one-dimensional. So at most, you can control one direction, horizontal or vertical. What we need is a 2-dimensional layout in tool where we create a layout, and then we just place content inside that layout. And that's what CSS Grid does. So again, Twitter Moments page with the current markup results in this mess. So if we then instead say, we'll take away all the extraneous stuff, anything we don't need, we get something much cleaner, a container and a bunch of items inside that container. In the HTML, it would look something like this. We find all the crap we don't need, take it out, look at that one more time and go, that's a list. So clean. so accessible, so uncluttered. How does that work on the front end? Well, you take your design, you put a grid on top of it, you identify the different areas in the grid. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And then you just impose that grid in the browser. Clean markup, CSS-only grid, looks exactly the same with like 200 times less code. So I have been told that listening to me speak can be a little bit of chasing a fire hose. So I'm going to try something here. You need to kind of balance yourself on the platform and be ready. And we'll go through all this really fast, because you'll hear this a couple of times now. So this is what we're aiming for in my example. So we have this layout that has a box at the top, and then a box on the side, and then some other weird stuff going on. And this is the markup we're using. So you'll notice right away that the markup here has the header on top, but in the actual layout, the header is sitting in that purple area, so it's not on top. And the layout doesn't match the markup at all. To make this happen, we use CSS Grid. And for CSS Grid, there's a bunch of terminologies. So we have CSS container, grid container, grid item, grid line, grid cell, grid track, grid area, and grid gap. These are the things that make up a grid. First, grid container. The grid container is any element on the page that you want to put a grid inside. So you can make as many grids as you want, or as few grids as you want. You can nest grids inside other grids. It works exactly like Flexbox. You just grab an element, and you call it display grid. A grid item is any first-level descendant of a grid container. So the first child of a grid container is a grid item, and any of the grid items can be placed anywhere on the grid. A grid line is either a horizontal line or a vertical line inside the grid that defines where these grid items are. A grid cell is the intersection between two lines, horizontal and vertical. A grid area is any rectangular area inside that you've defined. It can be one or more cells. Grid tracks are either horizontal tracks or vertical tracks. And the grid gap is the thickness of the lines. So basically gutters. These are the tools you have to define a grid. So to work with a grid, here's what you do. Number one, you define a grid. Number two, you place content on the grid. And number three, you make world peace. That's it. Thank you. No? OK, we'll go a little bit deeper. So the interesting thing about grid layouts is if you don't do anything, your grid items will just automatically be placed in the grid, starting from the top left-hand corner and just through the grid. That's what's called automatic placement. And if you choose to, you can also take any one of the items and physically place it inside the grid anywhere you want. That's called manual placement. And then you can do that with one item, and then the other items will just take up the other available space, or you can do it with multiple items. So if you look at my example again, the thing we start with is always just the standard responsive markup. Single block-level items in a vertical stack. Then we define a grid inside the container, setting display grid. Then we define columns and rows, and we do that saying, I'll take the edge of the grid, and then I define the width to the first line, and then the width to the second line, and then the width to the third line, and so on. So what you see here is we're using this new property called a fraction. And the fraction will say, here we are taking up 2 fractions of the available space, and 1 fraction and 1 fraction. And this FR property is super cool, because if you made a 4th column that was like 25%, then the 2, 1, and 1 FR ones would then take up 2 fractions and 1 fraction and 1 fraction of the available space after the 25% were taken out. So it makes things far more responsive, and it reduces the level of math skill you need to make things work, which is awesome. So you can do that with columns, and you can also do it with rows. As a result, you can define a completely specified grid that fits exactly your dimensions and your design. Once you've done this, the grid items automatically place themselves in the cells. And this is usually where people, when they start out, get all confused because like, I made a grid and then everything looks crazy because everything just places itself in the cells. Well, you need to take one more step. You need to manually place the items you want to manually place. And the way you do that is by going to each individual item in CSS and declaring grid column and grid row. And here, what I've done is pointed out which line numbers I want the item to appear between. So for instance, if I say grid column 2 to 4, the item gets placed between line 2 and line 4. If I say grid row 2 to 3, the item gets placed between line 2 and line 3. And you can do this with any grid item, meaning you can place any element anywhere in the grid at any time. And it doesn't matter what the actual HTML order is. Do that on a whole page, and you just end up with something completely different. That looks promising, but remembering all those lines can be really tricky, especially if you have responsive layouts where you change the grid constantly. So to solve that, we have something called grid areas. And grid areas is totally new and totally different. It uses this thing called grid template area and allows you to define, almost in an ASCII painting, the layout of the grid. So here, we have a grid that has 3 columns and 3 rows. And then we say, grid template areas, the first column has the first cell title, the second cell title, the third cell title. Then the second column, the second row has main, header, header, and the third one has main, sidebar, footer. So we give them actual names. And the names can be whatever you want. Then you use the grid area property on each individual item, and you just say where you want the item to appear on the grid. So here, the masthead goes to the grid area header, which is over there. Bloop. And you can just place any item anywhere you want. And the really cool thing about this is it now allows you to do these weird things with responsive web design you just could not do before. So because you're now defining the grid area names and positions, you don't have to work with the individual items. You just change the grid area positions. And that means in your responsive code, you just set up a grid, and you say where the areas are. Then you widen the screen, it looks like crap, so then you make a new grid, and you change the areas, and the items just pop around and position themselves wherever you want them to be. So the same markup with just responsive CSS can produce these completely different layouts, all depending on how wide the screen is. And it's all done in CSS. No HTML, no JavaScript, nothing fancy. On top of that, you can nest grids. So you can make a grid, and then make another grid inside, and make as many grids as you want. So remember the Twitter Moments page? This is a version of Twitter Moments page. It's just with not Twitter Moments. And you see the main grid here. So you see there are gutters, and you see the main items. But each individual card is also its own grid. Because it turns out, if you want to control the width of an item inside a card, using a grid is super simple. You just say how wide that item is, and they'll be consistent. And you can use the same code on all of them. So you just say, make a class called card grid or something like that, and you apply it to each of the cards, and then they all look exactly the same. So you have grids inside grids. So does that mean we no longer use floats and clears? Yeah, at least for layout. Because that's never what it was supposed to be for. Floats and clears were specifically for floating content in context. So you have an image or a block quote or whatever, and you put it inside text, and you want it to float to the left or right. That's what float and clear is for. So that's what you use it for. You want to position things in a 3-dimensional grid, or a 2-dimensional grid, then you use grid, because that's what grid is for. But it gets better. With CSS Grid, you can create these crazy responsive rows and columns. And the way you do that is by using this new function called min-max. The min-max function allows you to say, I want a column, and I want it to be minimum width 5 and maximum width 10 So it'll flex between those two sizes. And you can set the sizes to any type of property you want. So pixels or ems or percentages or FRs or whatever. And the result is a grid layout that's responsive. So you can see how the different columns actually squeeze and reorganize as you squeeze in the width of the screen. There's a bit of a problem, though. You can see they spill over the edge because they're still locked. We still have the 6-column grid, and when there's no more room, we can't do anything with it. The good news is the grid container is actually a flexbox. So if you use the right properties, you can get the grid to wrap like a flexbox, and you can make truly responsive grids where items will actually reposition themselves depending on the available space. So if I have this grid, which is like the default boring grid, right, with 6 columns, and I try to reduce the width, I end up with that problem you saw before. But if I set justify content center, you can see that the content shifts over and center aligns for me. And if I say justify content space between, the items become space between. So I have control over what's happening in between the items, just like you do in a flexbox. But they spill over the edge. So in my code, I introduced this repeat auto-fit or repeat auto-fill. And I tell the browser, hey, so I want the columns to be 10 ems wide. But I want you to figure out how many columns you can fit inside the container. And then I want you to distribute the items inside my grid the way you think is best. Right? Trust the browser. It usually knows what it's doing. So what you end up with is this. So you can see the columns are culling, and the grid will just organize itself for you. Now, I said there's 2 properties, right? There's autofill and autofit. And they work slightly differently, but you only really see it if you only have a couple of items. So here, I have 3 items. And you can see that autofill adds in empty columns at the end, because there's empty columns available. Autofit collapses those empty columns and just places the items where I want them to be. So here we have 3 columns, even though there's technically space for more, and then I can use justify content to justify them across the screen. So this pretty much gives you flexibility to do anything you want with layouts, and they're fully flexible. If you combine all this together, you end up with this. A flexible grid that first rearranges itself to fit all the content, and then eventually, when you get down small enough, starts resizing the content until you hit the min factor, at which point they lock. Truly fluid grids. If you want to play with this, I put up a playground for you on CodePen, so you can just plug in whatever values you want. Don't worry, the slide URLs are on the website. I'm going to put up a whole page with extra links, but find them on CodePen. I'm just Morten, and you'll see it there. And you can play around with it. This is truly powerful stuff. Which brings us to the inevitable question, right? I'm sure you've all encountered older browsers. They tend to stand in the way of doing all cool things. First of all, CSS Grid is currently live in all modern browsers. So if you only care about people on modern devices, you're good. Of course, there's a slight modification to this statement. Internet Explorer 10 and 11 support the old spec for CSS Grid. And that's because CSS Grid was created for Windows 8. And it's actually built into the core of Windows. And Internet Explorer is part of the core of Windows. So they can't simply just update the spec inside Windows without rewriting Windows entirely. But Edge, which is the browser all Windows users will get to eventually, releases the full grid spec on my birthday because they really like me. Or maybe just because it was a random Tuesday. So Tuesday the 17th of October, which is what, next week? The week after? CSS Grid will be live across all modern browsers. Which means they're perfectly safe to use if you only care about modern browsers. However, if you have to deal with older browsers, there are workarounds. The first one is you can use what's called a feature query A feature query looks like this. It's exactly like a media query, except you say @supports instead of @media, and then you specify some CSS property. And you ask the browser, hey, do you understand this? And the browser will say either yes or no. So if the browser doesn't understand @supports, it'll be like, I'm just going to ignore whatever's here. If the browser understands @support, it'll go, what are you testing for? And it'll see display grid. I don't know what that is. And then it'll just ignore the code underneath, which means you'll then serve up some other code instead. The cool part is grid is just like Flexbox in that if the browser doesn't support grid, it just falls back to block. So you can actually safely put CSS grid into code and know that the browser will handle this without like exploding everything. There's a problem though. If you do it the way I do it, things will not look the same across all browsers, which is how it should be. You see, this talk is not merely a talk about CSS grid, it's actually a talk about paradigm shifts. So I want you to come into my paradigm. And it requires really wrenching your brain and thinking about things differently. So bear with me for a second. You all design responsive websites right now. If you don't, come talk to me, and I will help you. The whole premise of responsive web design is that we provide different experiences based on the width of the device a person is using. It also means that whatever device you're on, you always get the experience you want, and whatever works on a small device also works on a bigger device. This whole idea that all websites must look the same across all browsers is nonsense. It was never true before, and it is not true now. The only reason why we do it is because we, people in this room, tell our clients all websites should look the same across all browsers. That's a choice we've made. We can undo that choice and just say no. Responsive web design works this way, and it also works in time. You've heard about this idea called progressive enhancement, that you provide better experiences or different experiences as the browser gets more advanced. That's actually just part of responsive web design. It just adds a time dimension to responsive web design. So in addition to making it responsive this way, you make it responsive based on the version of browser the user is using. And accessible mobile-first layouts actually work fine on all screen sizes, no matter what you do. Case in point, our friend Twitter. This is the desktop version. This is the mobile version. Same content, less crap. See? Crap, crap, no crap. Wikipedia, desktop version, mobile version. Same content, less crap. Crap, no crap. If you go to mobile websites, you'll notice they just have less crap. So there's no reason that you can't serve that up to all browsers. And then if that browser does support grid, you just go, OK, well, just make that no crap layout have a grid layout in addition. So embrace progressive enhancement and use the paved desire paths. Because the reality is this is what we've always wanted. Now we actually have to do it because it's there. So here's your practical approach to using CSS Grid right now when you walk out this door. First of all, every time you build a site from here on forward, start by building an accessible mobile-first layout. And that's the baseline you serve up to every single browser. Single column, accessible code, very simple. Number two, use that mobile-first layout as your fallback. So if older browsers are accessing it, they get the mobile layout. Then use the @supports rule to detect grid support. Find the appropriate grid breakpoints where you want to introduce your grids, and explore new layouts for modern browsers. Having seen all this, you're probably like, I don't remember every single piece of code you showed me. Can you please repeat? There's a ton of information out there, and this is something that you need to learn, because this is coming. Everyone is going to do this from here on forward, and you are well served by investing time in figuring this out. So here are some resources you can use right now. First of all, Firefox, the nightly version and the developer version, currently have a grid inspector. So you saw when I was showing the grids and you could see the lines inside the grid, that's Firefox. But it's not the live version of Firefox, it's the nightly version or the developer version. It'll eventually make its way into the live version too, but it'll take time. So if you want to work with grids, go get Firefox Nightly, put it on your computer, click on the Layouts tab inside your code inspector, and you'll see the actual grids on your page. Second, Rachel Andrew has the most detailed breakdown of the CSS grid spec on a page called Grid by Example. This site was built before Grid worked in any browsers. And she's been documenting absolutely everything there is to know. So if you want to use CSS Grid, you start here with her website. In addition, she has a book coming out a couple of weeks from now, or next week, or something like that, called The New CSS Layout, that you should all buy. You can get it in a digital version. It'll have all the information you need. MDN has exhaustive documentation on every element I've been talking about, and a ton more with code examples and everything. And if you find something that doesn't work, type it in, fix it, make it better. Mozilla has a CSS playground where you can play around with it and see what's happening. They also have a demo site with a ton of examples of what you can do with CSS Grid. CSS Tricks has their own complete guide to CSS Grid, which matches the complete guide to Flexbox, which everyone probably has used at some point. I have a WordPress theme you can pick at if you want to see if you can figure it out. I built an article for Smashing Magazine about this and how to use it in different themes. My course on LinkedIn Learning is free for everyone without a contract until October 25th. And if you want 3-month access, you can come talk to me, and I have cards in my pocket. There's places you can learn this. But most importantly, CSS Grid is actually the layout tool we've been looking for on the web since the first web page was built in 1990. It took 27 years. 27 years is enough time to wait. You need to start using this today because this is what we've always wanted. So go build your own desire paths, and when you do, remember, number 1, make it accessible. Number 2, make it fancy. And number 3, make sure your fancy doesn't break accessibility. Thank you very much.
We have about 20 minutes for questions, so raise your hand, or I'm going to awkwardly stare at you for 20 minutes.
Hi.
Hi.
But for emails, we should still use tables, right?
So I have this other talk that it's funny you should say that. What I didn't bring up is way back historically, there was this thing called table layouts. And the funny thing is, table layouts in CSS Grid is actually very similar. So if you go back and you read like ancient web documentation from like 1994, 95, you'll find people talk about how to make these advanced grids using tables. And there's some useful information in there. Not a lot, but there's some ideas in there that got scrapped because table layouts were too complicated that are actually worth re-exploring. Yesterday on Twitter, there's a conference somewhere else, and someone at that conference said, stop using other websites as inspiration for your websites. This is really important because every single website that's currently live on the internet is based on the previous paradigm where we didn't have grid layout. So if you're using other websites as a baseline, you're using a baseline that doesn't have our current tools. So this is your opportunity to come up with completely new and completely different things. And the reality is, if you come up with something really cool and you put it on the internet, other people will notice. And next year, you'll be standing out here talking about the cool, awesome thing you did that changed how people design websites. This is your opportunity to do new things. And then figure out how to make CSS Grid work in emails also.
Hi. Thanks for the talk. That was really amazing. So going back to like just supporting older browsers, let's say that for whatever reason I really wanted to get grids in some older version of IE. Is there like a polyfill that I could use or anything similar?
There is no polyfill. It's because, well, you saw it here, like CSS Grid is very complex. There's a lot of stuff going on, and there was a polyfill at one point, and it simply did not work. However, Rachel Andrew, who's the person who's been doing this stuff for a while, she has a page on Grid by Example that breaks down in excruciating detail how to do fallbacks for all the different grid features. And the reality is, you can't make a fallback that looks exactly like your grid, but using flex, float, tables, and all sorts of other stuff, you can actually make something that looks really close. So what you end up with is basically you make two style sheets, one that's for older browsers and one that's for new browsers. What I'm trying to get people to do is not do that. Because we have a tendency of always wanting to, or always being really reluctant to adopt new technology because there's one person who doesn't have that new technology. And like I said, it's very much rooted in this idea that everyone must have the same experience, while in reality, the whole purpose of the web is for everyone to be able to access the content in the best possible way. Now, the best possible way is actually however that content is presented to them so they can access the content. And in most cases, rather than trying to force older browsers to make things look as if they have CSS Grid, an older browser should be served up with an experience that fits best for that browser. And that's why I'm saying mobile-first layout in an older browser, if it's done right, will work just as well as a grid. And the reality is that person will never know they're missing the grid layout. They'll just see the content, and that's all they care about.
Another question?
Okay, hi. So great talk. I've been bouncing back between feeling excited and depressed during this whole talk. I have a question about IE11 support. Since we're stuck with it till at least 2025, how well does, for instance, auto-prefixer use the old IE syntax for CSS grids? Does it, or do we need a whole other layout fallback like floats or other things? Or are we just good with auto-prefixing it?
Auto-prefixer used to automatically prefix CSS Grid back to IE markup, so the -ms stuff, and they turned that off. And there's a very good reason for it. The features in CSS Grid, the original spec, and the features in the current version of CSS Grid diverge. So some things are the same. Like you can make columns and rows, it's the same. You can do positioning, that's the same. Grid areas are not the same. Line naming, you can actually give each line as many names as you want, it's not the same. The flexbox stuff is not the same. So yes, you can use auto-prefixer. It's risky because you'll get unexpected behavior out of it. So, but that doesn't mean you can't fall back to IE 10 and 11. It just means you need to write up your code for IE 10 and 11 manually and test it in IE 10 and 11 and make sure that it actually works properly, right? So again, don't do that. Serve up something else for older browsers. Because if you try to make it work in older browsers, you'll spend so much time doing it that you'll eventually not use CSS Grid in your current browsers. So you're basically holding everything back, right? That's why Flexbox took so long. It's because everyone's like, I can't use it because older browsers don't do it. we can't keep doing that. We need to have a structural method for moving forward. Progressive enhancement is your friend. Use it. And you're all sitting here thinking the same thing, which is, I can't sell this to my client. Yes, you can. You sell your client on all sorts of bullshit all the time. Right? They want cat pictures. You're like, nah, because of, like, you are a salesperson. You're also an expert. If the plumber comes into your house and says, actually, you need to put like an angle bracket here because the plug is not working the way it's supposed to, you don't go, no, 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 no. It looks bad. I want something else, right? You go, oh, yes, plumber, please do whatever you need to do, right? You're the plumber. You get to do whatever you want, and you get to explain to your client why that's the best solution. And the best solution is actually to provide a different experience for older browsers. Because all the people on newer browsers will then get the best possible experience without the people on older browsers getting an ungood experience. That's a great word, ungood. That's in the dictionary, right? Yes.
By the way, if you have a question, keep your hand up so I can come find you.
Hi. Do you have any proposal for like re-educating our beloved designers? Because we were like telling them, yeah, no, you can't do it like InDesign, blah, blah, blah. Mm-hmm. And now they are like, well, you fools have grids now. Any idea?
So, how many designers are in the room here? How many of you watched this and went like, either, I don't understand the code, or, this looks oddly familiar? No one? Everyone's like, that's fine. I also do CSS, I'm good. Well, that's great. So the very cool thing about both Flexbox and CSS Grid is this idea that we've always had about designers actually working with the browser as a design surface instead of Illustrator or InDesign or whatever, has always been hampered by the fact that they want to do things that can't be done. CSS Grid, once explained to a designer, is like, oh, I understand this, I can do this. I convert designers into designing in the browser all the time using Flexbox and CSS Grid. Flexbox is easy because it's like, oh, you want to make a menu horizontal, just say display flex, boom. And then want to see what it looks like, center aligned, justify content center, right? And they go like, oh, this is way easier than Photoshop because I don't have to drag and measure and blah, 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 right? And they realize, I'm designing stuff for the web. It should really be in the web. Now that's, you can teach them CSS. If you're a designer, go learn Grid and Flex now, and you'll have a better design surface. But, and this is where things get crazy, I guarantee within a year, there will be tools on the web, probably from Squarespace or Wix or WordPress or something, where you can open a little window, and there are rulers, and you can pull a ruler out, and then pull another ruler out, and then pull a ruler, and then just take your items and position them in the grid wherever you want, and then click Save. It spits out the HTML and the CSS, and it'll be fully semantic. The grid code will make sense, and you just put it onto a web page. Or it'll just be the web page. And then Adobe will roll out some new version of whatever, and they'll have a ruler that goes, and you'll sit there and be like, no, 1 pixel to the left, please. And then Adobe will be like, oh, you've been working on this for 7 hours, I'm just going to stop without saving. So the tools are coming that will actually bridge the gap between design and development. So this idea of WYSIWYG, which has always been a lie, is suddenly not a lie anymore. It's just no one's built the tool yet. So again, opportunity. Go build this thing, because it's totally doable. I have a prototype on my computer. The other computer, I can't show you. But it actually works. You can use some JavaScript and stuff and just make an interface where you draw the grids, and then you can get it to spit out actual readable CSS. So this is the time when designers are going to come and encroach on the space of front-end developers. So if you want to be fruitful in this industry, you need to beef up your skills.
Another question here in the back.
Yo, hey man, great talk. I, as a silly designer, have a question. This whole grid thing looks pretty static to me. It looks like basically like newspapers. How does this handle any animation, any interactivity, any wicked scenarios? What if one of those cells suddenly decides that it wants to be bigger? I don't know, content dynamically loads into it, it wants to enlarge. Can it float into another big space? Can it dynamically rearrange? Any case of drag and drop interactions, I take something from a sidebar and drop it onto a cell and then it pops open or something. Like, this looks good for, 100-year-old newspaper design. But if you take any fanciness into this, how does it handle that?
So you can, if you think about the grid container as just a box, you can do all the animation stuff you want with the box itself. Right? So you can do this, and you can move it around and everything. Inside the container, so if you have an item in a cell, you can't animate it to go from one cell to another cell, or go from the width of one cell to the width of 2 cells. There's currently no support for that. That might very well come once people start working with it, but there's currently no functional way of doing it. So if you do something like that, you'll get popping behavior, unless you mess around with with JavaScript, right? So it's limiting, but it's limiting because this is brand new. Brand new. It only came live in any browsers in April this year. So there's stuff going to happen in the back end. And this, again, is one of those examples of if enough people start messing around to try to make animations inside grids happen, you're basically making a path. And if enough people use the path, then the browser manufacturers will be like, we need to put a road here because this is ridiculous, right? So I'm totally serious about the whole try to do new things. That said, you can do weird things with grids that you haven't been able to do before. Like, you can make a grid that's wider than the viewport and then move the entire grid around. Or you can make a grid and then put another grid on top of it and then display multiple layers of content. And you can take an element inside a grid and put it on top of another element, or put it on top of multiple different elements, and use z-index to switch the order of them. Because grid actually allows you to stack multiple items in the same cell. So there are all these things that used to be super hard, like absolute positioning, you don't have to do anymore. You just position content in the grid, layer more content on top, make transparencies. It's really, the possibilities are so vast, I can't go through it in an hour-long talk. There's just too much going on.
I have a question about accessibility in the ARIA sense. So it seems like because we've really cleaned up the syntax, it would make things better for people using screen readers and things like that. Have you seen any research about that at all? Or
well, accessibility is the positive and negative part of this. On the positive side, CSS Grid allows us to use really well marked up HTML and then use CSS if we want to do any weird positioning stuff. The challenge with that is it's tempting to then mess up the visual order of content. So you say you want a layout where you have a header, then you have a sidebar here and a content here, and then you want to move the sidebar to the front, right? Then the sidebar is still at the bottom of your HTML, and you just move it up here. If someone then tabs through the content, they will tab through the header, then the main content, and then jump up to the sidebar, which is OK. But if you then start moving the footer on top of the sidebar, or put an ad on top of the sidebar or something else, then the user has to tab through everything on the page to get back up to top again. So if you change the visual content order, and it doesn't correspond with the tab order anymore, then that becomes an accessibility issue, unless you're putting content at the top that no one cares about, like an ad, right? So if you want to put ads in sites, I wonder if you should maybe put them at the bottom of your HTML and then use grid to place them on top, because then someone using a screen reader won't get trapped inside the endless iframe hell of an ad, right? It'll actually be on the bottom of the HTML. So there are possibilities here, but there are also challenges. The other accessibility challenge is that because the grid only places items that are first-level descendants, there's a tendency to want to flatten your HTML structure to make everything a first-level child, right? Which takes away all semantic order. The solution to that is to start thinking of multiple grids. So you don't use one grid, you actually use several. So you maybe have a layout grid for the whole page that lays out your header, your sidebar, your footer, that stuff. And then inside your main content, you might have another grid that just manages the order of your content. And inside there, you may have another grid that just handles a gallery or something like that. And that way you can preserve proper content nesting and semantic order while at the same time taking full advantage of the grid. And the reality is, if you make multiple grids, you can do these amazing responsive things, because then you can work on component level. And the other part of that is, just like Flexbox, CSS grid follows text direction. So if any of you ever work with right to left language websites, or websites that need to switch between them, and you use CSS grid as your layout tool, you don't have to do anything. If you just say right to left as the text direction, the grid flips. And all the content inside the grid flips with it. You can also, if you want to do some sort of sorting thing, you can change the direction of the grid itself. So by default, the grid is populated from the top left to the bottom right. Left to right, yes. Top left to bottom right. You can change that direction to either start top right to bottom left, or start bottom right to top left, or bottom left to top right. So you have control over every aspect of this.
Thanks. We have time for one last question.
Anyone from this side? No?
All right. Thanks for the talk. I have a quick question. Since the grid is now built into the browser, is it reasonable to expect any performance improvements, perhaps in rendering time, because it's built into the browser?
There are several levels to this. So there are performance enhancements in that your HTML will be dramatically simplified, right? That's just, the HTML itself is better for CSS grid. If you use any kind of framework, you're taking the framework away. So all the crazy nonsense that's happening there just goes away with it. So that improves performance. If you paid close attention to some of my videos, you notice there was a lot of like going on. That's because, so the browsers still have a bit of trouble figuring all this out because there's so much math happening, but all of that is happening at the client end. So the actual performance for normal people, like we are crazy people because we do this with browsers all the time. No human being does that. Like that's not a real scenario that anyone ever does. So apart from actual messing around with the width of the viewport, there isn't much in terms of performance loss there. The only challenges go in like if you try to do something really nuts that is nesting a million grids inside one another. The only time I ever experienced creating something in grid that did not perform as well as another solution was I layered 8 grids on top of one another, and then I made them all transparent, and then I made a parallax effect where the grids would slide like this underneath one another, right? And then when you scrolled, it would also parallax vertically like this. And I'm not sure if it was the grid part that was driving my browser crazy or it was just all the transparencies and everything. But because you can now layer infinite layers on top of one another, you're creating more complex layouts that take up more processing power, right? So the spec itself does not have performance impacts. Mostly it makes it more performant. But if you do crazy things, all things go out the window, right?
Thank you.
Thank you all.